Okay, so I talked about the information cascades paper by Bikhchandani and others, and we are almost done. I didn't talk about the very last slide, so I'll take 5 minutes to talk about a few issues there. And then in most of today's lecture, I'll talk about voting models. Okay. So the Bikhchandani paper is quite nice. It's very readable, user-friendly. So I strongly encourage you to read it independent of the slides here. And there's a lot of discussion. The model is, of course, very simple and bare bones, but it's a rich enough structure that you can discuss some other issues, even in a hand-waving way. So here's a few things that we can think about using that simple model. So in our model, every investor or agent had information of the same quality, right? Everybody had a signal of precision P, if you remember. Right? P didn't have a subscript. It wasn't agent I's signal has precision PI. That's not we imposed some sort of homogeneity. Now, what if people have information of different qualities, right? So, for example, the people investing in the beginning may have slightly better information than others. So one sort of extreme way of thinking about it is to say that, well, the very first agent has a signal and its conditional probability of being correct is P1, which is strictly greater than the P of all the agents coming afterwards, right? So this means that the very first agent has slightly better information. So if you go back and look at the model and think through, you will see that in this situation, even the very first investor will start a cascade with probability 1. Okay, so why is that? Suppose the first investor gets a high signal and invests. So the second investor coming afterwards knows that this guy had a high signal. Suppose the second investor himself got a low signal, right? But their signals are not of the same precision. The first investor's signal is slightly better, okay? So the two high and low signals will not cancel out as far as the second agent is concerned, right? Even after Bayesian updating, the second agent will believe that there's a greater than half chance that the state is a good state because the first guy with superior information got a high signal. And my signal is low, but my information is inferior. The quality of my information is inferior. So if the first investor in this situation invests, then everybody coming after will invest, even if they get low signals themselves. So we have a cascade starting right from the first guy with probability 1. Now, if P1 is only slightly better than P, this is going to lower overall welfare, right? That should also be obvious. When everybody has signal of the same quality, the first several signals with some probability may get aggregated, right? The decision in the long run may not depend just on the first signal. It may depend on the first few signals. Whereas here, it depends only on the signal of the first guy. So if the first guy's signal is just P plus epsilon is something very, very small, then the overall welfare in this case will diminish, right? So you can have things like fashion leaders, you know, some people with only slightly superior information may themselves trigger a cascade, and that may lower the overall welfare. You can apply the same logic in thinking about public release of information. Yes, in general, you would think that if the authorities, the government, or somebody has some information, maybe the information is noisy, what's the harm of releasing it into the public domain, right? It cannot make things worse. It can only make things better. That's what we would normally think. But in this sort of cascade-like situation, things can sometimes get worse due to public release of information. So let's say the information being released is exactly like this, right? It's like the first investor's signal it is slightly superior or slightly less noisy than the signals of individual agents. So if such information is released into the public domain, that means that every agent, starting from the very first one, will just look at the public signal and make a decision based on that. So individual signals will not be aggregated at all. Yes. So once again, if the public signal is only slightly, very slightly superior to the individual signals, this will actually lower welfare instead of raising it. Yes. So there's some value to crowdsourcing of, collecting information from disparate sources. And what this model is telling us is that there's this information aggregation process can get choked due to the kind of mechanisms that this model brings out. So we have to think very, very carefully about, in this sort of situation, this kind of context, one has to be very careful about when and how much information is released into the public domain. While we're talking of heterogeneous information, when agents are not similarly informed, suppose some agents have slightly better information than others. For example, suppose there's a meeting, a board meeting, a faculty meeting in a university, corporate meeting, something. Some people are seniors, they have more experience, maybe their signals are better. Some others are junior, their signals are more noisy, they don't have that much experience with that kind of decision making. In meetings, there's deliberation and debate, right? People present their points of view, everybody comes in with some, they argue for a certain course of action or another. They give the logic and evidence behind the position they're taking. So an important aspect of institutional design is how to structure the conversation and the debate, right? Who should speak first? Should the senior people speak first or should the junior people? Yes. Now, in that kind of context, the motives of people may also have other dimensions. For example, people may be interested also in reputation or image. People may want to sort of not come across as being not well informed and so on. But that aside, if there's sequential kind of speech or debate or decision making, the question is, should the juniors or the seniors speak first? Now, if the seniors go first, if their signals are less noisy, that might precipitate an early information cascade, right? So the juniors coming after them may just mimic the seniors, yeah, and not speak their minds or express their true opinions. Whereas if you place the juniors first, then they have no option. There's nobody to mimic. So in that case, their information may be better incorporated in the decision-making process. So many kinds of design and strategic factors like that can be thought about using this sort of model that we have just seen. Another thing is that cascades can be fragile, or fads can be fragile. Okay. You can have a situation where large numbers of people are doing the same thing, right? And you often see this. You see this in the cultural domain, for example. Yeah, you have these certain songs or certain sort of these dance routines on TikTok or what have you, which sort of become very catchy, right? Everybody is doing that. You have certain stocks, they become hot, right? Everybody starts buying. I remember, you guys are too young, at the height of the dot-com bubble, there was this company called Perfumania, right? It was a company selling perfumes online. and it suddenly became like a big craze, and its stock prices went through the roof. But if you think about it, I mean, perfume is one thing which you don't probably want to buy remotely or online. You want to know what it smells like. So brick and mortars, this is unlike a book or an electronics good. So the company soon went bust, and a lot of people lost money on it. So you often see that cascades are fragile. They seem to be robust for a while. The housing bubble, the dot-com bubble, at the time they seemed like, there to stay, and everybody was buying that stuff. But when it also burst very quickly. I also showed you the graph of the tulip mania, right? When the price crashed, it literally fell off a cliff. Uh, and this fragility can also be understood with a model like this. So once again, think of slightly heterogeneous information structures, right? Most people have information of quality P, um, and suppose a cascade has formed, so everybody is mimicking the ones who came before. And suddenly there comes an agent who has a slightly better signal than others, right? Who has a P1 signal accuracy strictly greater than P. And if this person does the opposite of what the herd was doing, then you will have the whole herd coming after that will flock to the new guy, right? Or start mimicking the new guy. So everybody was buying a stock, and suddenly one guy with slightly superior information comes along and chooses not to buy it or sells it off. And then that triggers a massive sell-off. So that's another thing that we can think of, this fragility. Last point, and somebody raised it during the lecture in the last class, right? And the question is, the model kind of artificially assumes that there's a fixed predetermined sequence in which people have to make decisions. Now, if you think of, let's say, the stock market, I can buy a stock today or tomorrow or the day after tomorrow. I can also choose my timing. Yes. So what happens, do these information cascades, yeah, I think Arnav, you asked the question, right?
Yes, sir.
Yeah. So can these information cascades form if you have endogenous timing, if people can wait before they make their choices, right? Now, there's a very well-known paper by uh, Gale and Shamley, and they actually have a book which they wrote, where they explore this by creating a richer model where people can choose when. So they arrive in a sequence, but they can wait. They can choose to invest on a later date. Okay. The cover of Gale and Shamley's book has the picture of a penguin, an emperor penguin. Now, why do I have to put the picture of a penguin on the cover? The reason is as follows. Apparently, flocks of penguins, they kind of roam around on these ice packs, ice shelves, right? And there's the sea at the edge of the ice pack. And penguins have to jump into the sea from time to time to take a bath, to get some food, to catch some fish. But they're afraid of sharks in the water, right? Um, Sharks or seals or predators, yes. So when it comes the time to take a bath or to go fishing, they don't want to be the first one, right? They want some of their friends to jump in, see what happens to them, and if they survive, don't get eaten up by a shark, then they'll follow. And apparently they hover at the edge of the ice pack, close to the water, and often from time to time, some poor penguin get pushed into the sea by his friends, so-called friends, right? And that phenomenon has been observed by field zoologists. So that's an example where everybody's waiting out to see whether the state of the world is favorable or not, and nobody wants to go first. So maybe, short of foul play, like pushing somebody in, this spell of inactivity, nobody jumping in, this can only be broken by somebody who comes along, who has superior information, whose signal quality is high, noise level is low, and who gets a favorable signal, right? And there may be a considerable period of time before that happens. Now, you can extend that sort of logic and reasoning to booms and slumps, for example. Yes. Keynes famously mentioned that, booms and slumps have this animal spirits driving them often, right? Investment, you must have read in your macro that, investment is a lot more volatile than consumption at the macro level. So it's really investment expenditure which drives business cycles, right? Is a primary driver. That when investment picks up, we have a boom. When it collapses, we have a slump. Now, if we are in a recession and investment is tepid and lukewarm and at low levels, this sort of problem will keep prolonging the recession, because investors are worried about whether the economy will turn around and whether there'll be a market, or whether there has been enough pent-up consumer demand which has built up, so that if they invest and extend their capacity, they can sell the product, right? They don't want to invest too early and have inventories piling up. But who's going to test, right? The first or second investor who does that is basically experimenting on behalf of others, right? So you can have a long lull, even when some of the fundamentals of the economy has actually improved. Investors may still be waiting out and waiting for others to test the waters, right? And see whether the winds have changed. So again, that's applications of this sort of model can extend even to macro and business cycles. Questions? Yes? Not at all. Everybody's waiting like the penguins. Okay, so let me now switch gears and move to the sort of, make the pendulum swing to the other end, almost, as it were. So the information cascades model that you saw is, you can say, it's an illustration of the possibility of madness of crowds, large numbers of people making the same choices. We learn later that the choice was wrong. Yes. But then, as I said, there's also the idea of wisdom of crowds, that each individual person in a crowd may be prone to errors, may have very limited knowledge or information, but somehow, defined in some sense, the collective choice may be very accurate. So that is wisdom of crowds, right? I think I mentioned the example of an ox weighing competition, which was mentioned by Francis Galton in the early 20th century. Right? People were taking the guess about a large ox. Whoever came closest to the real actual weight would be the winner. So there were various entries. Galton noted down all the entries. The winner had, the winner was off from the actual weight by, some margin. It was a lower margin than others. But when Galton calculated the average of everybody's guesses, he found that it was only 1 pound. The weight of the ox was more than 1,000 pounds. And the average of the crowd's guess was just off by 1 pound. And the winner of the contest was off by many, many pounds, right? So the crowd as represented by its average guess, was the wisest of them all. Yeah. Um, so, and that's really the driving force there is the law of large numbers. Yes. So if you think of a bunch of sensible people based on eye estimate trying to guess what the weight of an ox is, some will have an overestimate, some will have an underestimate, yes. But you can think of their guesses as basically an unbiased sort of stochastic simulation, right? The average or the expected guess mistake may be close to zero. So if you therefore aggregate a large number of guesses, then you will get a number which is very close to what it actually is. Now, processes of social learning and social decision making, which can somehow harness this property, will lead to very good decision making. Yes, that's the idea. So to examine that idea, we'll switch gears. We'll move from private decision making, like in a stock market, right? Everybody is making his or her individual decision, watching others, seeing what others have done, and being influenced by that. But each person has a separate decision to make, right? So you may buy a stock, I may not buy the same stock, right? We can make different decisions at the end of the day. Now, in voting, yes, we vote differently, but we are making a collective choice, right? And so let's see, what happens in voting. Now, let me say a few things as preface before I introduce the concrete ideas and look at models. What is the voting model you have studied? Right? In economics, we study markets, prices, etc. But I'm sure, especially in your second micro course, you have studied a model of voting, right? Can somebody recall what that model was? Which model am I talking about? You haven't studied any game which is a kind of a, which is trying to model elections.
So, is it that game which was about provision of a public good where everybody can decide to contribute? I mean, no.
Well, that's not quite voting. That's a public goods contribution game, right? Yes, there's a public good, but it's not going to be built by the government. It's going to be built by private contributions, right? So the public good aspect is there, but contributions are still decentralized. In voting, what we do is that we elect a government, and that government builds or does not build the public good through taxation. So the question is, how do we decide what kind of government to elect, which party to vote to power? No memory? Hotelling's model, yes. Steve. That's right. So today's prize goes to Steve. Remember the Hotelling model? There were two interpretations. One is that, it's like a long street like Janpath or a stretch of beach. And the game is a competition between different vendors who are deciding where to locate, whether to locate at the center or towards one of the edges. But another interpretation of the same model was that that straight line is a political space. So for example, the straight line is what should be the tax rate, what percentage of the economy should be in the public sector, taxed away by the government and spent on public goods. Should it be 20%, 30%, 40%, right? That's what we are voting over. And you have two political entrepreneurs, not economic entrepreneurs, like two political parties who commit to platforms. One of them says, if elected, I will make a government of size 20% of the economy. Tax rates will be 20%. Another says, no, if you elect me, I'll create a 40% size government. Yeah, and then we as voters decide who to elect. What was the main result in that model?
Median voters' preferences get
The
selected.
median voter theorem, right? If you have two parties, every voter has a bliss point, right? I want government size to be 20%. You want 25%, right? Somebody else wants 30%. So all of us have different preferences. If you arrange the bliss points in ascending order, there will be a median preference so that 50% of the voters want something less than that and 50% want something more than that. So the prediction of the two-party hoteling model is that competing politicians, office-seeking politicians, will choose the median voters' most preferred policy. Okay. Now, let's still take a step back. What is this model about? Right. This model is about preference aggregation. How voting reconciles fundamentally conflicting preferences. Right? That we have different preferences about social policy, collective choices. Right? What should be the size of government? We don't agree. Our preferences are fundamentally different. So through voting, we resolve it, and the model has predictive power. It says the median voter's preferred point will come about. That will be the outcome. But the model is about preference aggregation. Yes. Now, certain kinds of choices, social, collective, political choices, are about things where we have substantially collective interest. Yes. For example, on many macroeconomic issues, if the economy is in a recession, everybody gains if we can pull it out of recession. Yes. But people may differ about what kind of policy will achieve that. Should it be a big stimulus, Keynesian stimulus, or should it be austerity that the government, cuts back on expenditure and so on? So you may be a Keynesian, I may be a monetarist, or supply sider or something, and we may disagree over policy. But in terms of payoffs or motives, we have a common interest, right? We both want the economy to come out of a recession. We can't agree about what is the right method there. So certain kinds of choices produce disagreements not because of conflicting interests, but because of disparate information. You have read your Keynes and I've read my Friedman, and so that's why we are disagreeing. That's why we are debating the issue. Yeah, and neither of us is the Pope. And certainly one of us is wrong, right? But we don't know which one. So you can think also of voting as a way of information aggregation, not just preference aggregation, but information aggregation. Should we have free trade or should we have a much more protectionist policy? Should Britain leave the European Union or should it stay? And should it have Brexit or not, right? As they famously had the vote. So some of these decisions have this information aspect. Now, in most choices like that, there will be some degree of conflict of preferences and some degree of differences arise from information, because voters have different information. Yeah, the hoteling model focuses exclusively on the preference aggregation aspect. Right, the simple hoteling model basically says that voters have full information. They know the consequences of the policies. They just like different policies and the consequences that will arise from that. If I'm rich, maybe I'll want small government. I don't want high tax rates. If I'm poor, maybe my preference will be the opposite. Yes. So that's what the hoteling model does. It completely ignores any kind of information asymmetry between the voters and focuses only on clashing preferences. Now, we are going to study another framework, which I don't think you've seen before, which is the Condorcet framework, right? Condorcet comes after Marquis de Condorcet, who was a French mathematician. And he was one of the pioneers of studying social choice and voting, yes. So Condorcet focused on the other aspect that I just said, the information aspect, right? So to focus on that, we'll completely abandon hoteling altogether. We'll study voting games in which voters have completely common interest, right? That's artificial. You rarely run into such a pure situation. But to understand the logic of it, we'll focus on completely common interest voting games, right? So at the end of the day, I as a voter, if I gain, so do you as a voter. We know that. That is common knowledge. And we are trying to choose between a binary option or vote over binary options, whether to, let's say, join the WTO, whether to have Brexit or not, sort of binary options like that. And we have our own private noisy information, and we can only vote on the basis of that, right? So then what happens? Does information aggregation take place? Now, Condorcet, he kind of constructed this problem, analyzed it, not fully, and he reached a certain number of conclusions, which have come to be famously known as the Condorcet jury theorems. Yes. So let me summarize for you the conclusions. Jury theorems, because the voting problem you can think of as members of a jury voting to decide whether the defendant should be convicted or acquitted. That's a binary decision. There's a finite number of people who make that decision collectively, and they do it by voting. Yes. The jury metaphor is a little unfortunate because the voting games that we will study, the assumption is going to be that the voters cannot communicate with each other, right? If it's a common interest game and they could speak to each other, there's no incentive issue. There's no credibility problem like in the Crawford-Sobel model, right? You and I have the shared interests. So I'll frankly tell you what my information is, and you'll frankly tell me, and then we'll decide and we'll be in agreement about the decision. So the problem becomes interesting only if you assume that there's no communication, there's no direct communication. Yes. Now, in actual jury trials, there is communication. Juries are put in a room. If you've seen a film called 12 Angry Men with Henry Fonda in the lead role, it's a black and white movie many years ago. That is about jury deliberations, right? So 11 out of 12 people want to convict some defendant, and only one person, Henry Fonda's character, says, no, there is enough doubt. There is, and it's all about that. There's a Hindi version of this called, anybody seen the Hindi version of 12 Angry Men? These are ancient films, so even before my generation, forget yours. The Hindi version is called Ek Ruka Hua Faisla. Anyway, so juries famously do talk. They talk for hours. Yes. So don't take the jury metaphor literally. Yes. Essentially, the kind of voting game we're going to study involve large anonymous electorates where they cannot coordinate and share information with each other. They have to vote sitting in the separate islands. Yes. Okay. So what did Condorcet conclude about such voting processes? He came to two conclusions. One is the following. He said the decision of a jury will be correct more often than the decision of any single individual, right? So juries are wiser than judges. That's roughly speaking the first conclusion. The second conclusion is an asymptotic result. It says not only is a jury wiser than a judge, a larger decision-making body will be better than a smaller one. The probability that the jury is correct will approach 1 as the size of the jury grows to infinity. So very, very large juries are almost always correct. Yes, they're almost godlike, they're infallible, they almost surely know what the best choice is. Although they're composed of individuals whose knowledge is very fragile and limited. Every individual, every juror has extremely noisy signals, but their collective voting somehow leads us towards the best choice if the jury is very large. Yeah. So those are the results. Now, of course, the question is why, right? Are these results true, first of all? And what do you have to assume about the voting process, the information structure, so that we can confidently claim that these conclusions are true? So that's what we'll study, yes? What are the conditions that are needed for these conclusions to arise, to be valid? And, the conclusions, voting procedures differ a lot. In some institutions and contexts, you have simple majority voting or plurality voting if you have multiple options, but we'll only study binary option cases. And sometimes you have supermajority, like for a constitutional change, we need a supermajority, right? 2/3 or 3/4, that sort of thing. And sometimes you even have unanimity requirements that of the two choices, one cannot be chosen unless everybody agrees that should be the choice. So jury trial is a case in example. In most systems, all 12 jury members have to vote for conviction to be the conducting decision. If they don't, if even one person votes against that, then you have a mistrial, then it's cancelled. Then we cannot send the guy to prison. Okay, so one of the things to keep in mind is how well or how badly does information aggregation take place for these different kinds of voting rules. Yes. Now, as we study this, the early literature on this sort of thing studied statistical models, meaning that each juror was thought to have some exogenous probability of voting for the right thing. So let's say each for, we are voting over free trade versus a protectionist economy, whichever is the better choice for us. Each of us votes for the better choice with 70% chance, 30% chance I'll vote for the wrong thing. So in the statistical models, these probabilities are fixed. They're taken as given. Yes. Now that's a bit of an unsatisfactory assumption. Just give me a moment, guys. I'll have to answer the door. Back in 30 seconds. Okay, so in the statistical versions, or the statistical approach of modeling it, behavior is kind of taken as fixed, as I said. 70% chance that I'll vote for the right thing. the modern literature is strategic voting models, right? Where juries are modeled as players. They have objectives, they have information, all that is explicitly modeled. And the way people will vote will depend on the context, depend on the institution, the rules. So it depends on the size of the jury, whether the voting rule is majority or supermajority or unanimity. All those things will influence how people vote. So you can't assume that there's a fixed probability of voting for the right thing. Nevertheless, we will start with the statistical voting models, which is the sort of earlier approach, because it'll give us a key intuition, which will come in handy when we go to the more appropriate strategic voting models. Okay. Any questions at this point?
Sir?
Yes.
So, so we are assuming that the voters can't communicate amongst themselves?
That's right.
So how do they receive, so the kind of information they receive, like, is it, how do they get those kinds of, like, we also receive some information through communications. So
Yeah, I mean, it's like, okay, we are going to have a referendum vote on, let's say, people in Britain. They were going to vote over Brexit. Yes or no? Up, down vote. Yes. Leading up to the vote, it was a massive public debate and discussion. So in that sense, there was a lot of communication, and voters were, many voters were researching the issue. They were reading opinions of experts, etc., etc. Right? They were talking to others, a limited set of others. Yes. So in that sense, yes. So they're getting their signals through communication from media, from a few other voters. But tens of millions of voters eventually turned up on the day of the referendum, and majority of them, thin majority, voted for Brexit. Most of them didn't talk to each other, right?
yes.
So a stylized way of representing this complex picture is to say that, okay, in an abstract sense, you get a signal, communication from whatever, experts, etc., limited number of people. But then a large number of people, most of them not being able to talk to each other, have to cast their votes. Yeah.
So is it also the case that not always we can extend the number of people who can vote to say infinity, or a large number of people? Sometimes you might want to restrict in certain scenarios to a set of people who will decide on something. So in that case, sir, how to go about?
Yeah, so we'll analyze these models for a given n number of voters. Yes. And then as a design question, you can say, okay, even if we have 100 people available, should we ask all 100 to vote, or should we handpick 20 and say, you're the council of elders and you decide by voting?
Yes.
Okay. Now, part of the message is going to be that there's strength in numbers, right? That if we have a stock of 100 people, we don't want to limit it to 20. There's wisdom of crowds. There's an advantage to expanding the franchise, if you will, and bring everybody into the tent. That's right. So, there's a question of, is democracy a good thing? Right? Democracy is very recent. I mean, you had monarchies and oligarchies. You had a small bunch of people making decisions for a whole nation or population. Is democracy a good thing? Now, one response is axiomatic, that, we think democracy is a virtue for its own sake. Why shouldn't we have a participatory role in deciding the fate of our nation? In some sense, the Condorcet kind of analysis gives us an instrumental value of democracy, right? That we should expand the franchise and give the vote to everyone, men, women, not children maybe, because they need to get mature, but every adult, yes, because it pools more information, right? So the collective decision making becomes stronger and better as a result. Yes, even if you don't value democracy for its own sake, we may want to create democracy on the largest possible electorate so that the quality of the decision making improves for consequentialist reasons like that. Now, of course, Condorcet's jury theorem will need certain assumptions, conditions. So, all of this is provisional. So we'll see what applies. But in those situations where we can put our faith in Condorcet, the answer to your question is that, yeah, decision making will be better if you let all the 100 people decide rather than a coterie of 20.
Yes. Thank you, sir.
Yeah. Okay, so let's study a simple model of the statistical jury theorem. Any other questions? Okay, so let's see the model. We'll continue to use the metaphor of the jury trial without, as I said, without meaning it to be an analysis of only jury trials. In fact, not jury trials, big elections. Now, using the metaphor, we have a state of the world, as in all the models we have discussed so far. The state of the world is either guilty or innocent, denoted by G or I. Okay. One has to take a decision D, which can take two values, convict C or acquit A. So binary state of the world, binary decision. Now, there's a correct decision, but it's state dependent, right? When the defendant is guilty, we ideally want to convict. When the defendant is innocent, we ideally want to acquit. Decision should be A. Unfortunately, we don't know for sure. That's the problem. So there are n voters. Probability that voter J will vote correctly, that is to say, in the guilty state, vote for conviction, in the innocent state, vote for acquittal. The probability that will happen as far as voter J is concerned is some fixed number, Pj, okay? And it's between half and 1. It's more likely to take the correct decision than the incorrect one. The case where it's half is just when the vote is a pure noise, right? And let's also assume that these probabilities are independent. So I base my vote reading the Indian Express. You base your vote reading the Hindu. Yes. So they're independent draws. Conditionally independent draws. Okay, meaning that given the state, conditional on the state, these probabilities are independent. Now, we have a voting rule, which I'll capture by alpha. Alpha is a fraction, okay? So this fraction is basically capturing the minimum fraction of votes needed for a decision. So if alpha equal to half, that means we have a simple majority rule. Whichever option gets more than 50% of the votes is chosen. But alpha could be higher. Alpha could be, for example, 2/3. In jury rules, jury trials, it's actually unanimous. So you need unanimity for conviction, unanimity for acquittal, and any kind of hung jury, some people vote one way, some people vote the other, that leads to what is called a mistrial. And a new trial has to be called. Neither decision can be taken. So xj equal to 1. So now let's bring in an index variable. If j has voted correctly, then xj takes the value 1. If j has voted incorrectly, then xj takes the value 0. Now, what is the probability that the jury, under these assumptions, will take the right decision? Jury as a whole, not a single member of the jury, but jury as a whole. And that's going to depend on the size of the jury N and the voting rule adopted, alpha, obviously, right? But what is it? Well, it's described by this probability. It's easy to see, right? the number of correct votes, which is to say the number of xj's which take a value 1 rather than 0, right? The sum of all that has to cross over the threshold of decision making. Namely, at least alpha fraction of the voters have to cast the correct vote for the jury as a whole to take the correct decision. Otherwise, going by the rules, jury decision will not be right. Okay, so this is the probability we are interested in. Okay, so so the model is all specified, so we can say something about this. So let's think of a completely symmetric version of this, right? So all jury members are equally well-informed or equally ill-informed, right? So Pj equal to P for all j. All they have the identical probability of casting the right vote. Yes. Then this is the theorem. This is the result. There are two cases. Yes. One is that P is greater than alpha. So the accuracy parameter is higher than the voting threshold. Yes. If that is the case, then for a large enough jury, the probability that the jury will make a better decision is greater than P. Now, if you had a judge, if you had a single person making a decision, then that person will be correct with probability P, because that's the accuracy of the signal, right? Now, this object Pn of alpha is the probability of the jury. A jury of size n will have a higher probability of being correct than a single decision maker, right? So that will hold for a large enough jury if P is greater than alpha. So that means first part of Condorcet jury theorem, that box is ticked off. Yes, juries are wiser than judges. Juries of sufficiently large size. And also the second asymptotic property is also true in this case, right? The probability of the jury choosing correctly will approach 1 as the jury size goes to infinity. Unfortunately, if P is less than alpha, then exactly the opposite happens. We have anti-Condorcet results, right? So for large enough juries, the jury will actually have a higher chance of making a mistake. And if the jury size is very big, almost surely the jury will be wrong, right? Not correct. It'll be wrong with probability close to 1. So we have, even in this very simple setup, we have identified conditions that are required for Condorcet jury theorem to hold. Okay. Now, some corollaries of this is immediately obvious. If we have majority rule, right, so alpha is half, then the favorable condition is trivially met, right? The noise, P is bigger than half. P, the lowest possible value of P is half. And so if you have majority rule, P greater than alpha will always be true. And so Condorcet's results will prevail. If we have supermajority rule, then it may not happen. Essentially, under supermajority rule, individual voters must be sufficiently well-informed or accurate. The probability of making mistakes must be low enough, right? That's the condition that we need. So high thresholds are bad news. Okay. So let me give you an idea of why this is true, right? So there's a formal proof on the next slide. Let me skip that. I'll give you the idea so that you can kind of. And basically, this is being driven by the law of large numbers. Okay, the weak law of large numbers, let's say. It's the weak law of large numbers weaving its magic in this voting context. Now, if the information of voters could be pooled before the Brexit vote, Suppose Brexit was a common interest thing. So before a Brexit vote or a similar kind of referendum, if millions of people can get together in a room and tell each other what they know or what they think, the problem will be trivial. Yes. So statistics textbooks tell us that if you have many, many noisy pieces of information, and if you could somehow pool it together, and if you can look at that large sample of information or signals, not a problem. If your sample is big enough, you will have a very accurate estimate. Your standard errors will basically collapse to zero. In voting, voters have no direct way of doing that, and that's why the question is somewhat non-trivial, right? Will the weight of numbers crush the problem? That question is, I mean, it's not immediately obvious whether that will happen, and indeed you need conditions, as we just saw, for that to happen. So if it happens, why does it happen? Okay. All right. So here's P. So let's take a simple illustrative case where it's simple majority rule, right? So the voting threshold is half. And each individual signal is correct with probability P. Okay. Now, if you have, let's say, 10 people voting to decide, what's the chance that they'll vote correctly? So this blue thing is a probability distribution of the fraction of correct votes in this group. So that'll be a probability distribution, right? It'll be a binomial distribution, right? Each voter has a chance P of being correct. There are n of them. So what's the probability that, you know, only one is correct out of n? What's the probability only two are correct? What's the probability three are correct? All the way up to n. We can calculate all of those probabilities. It will be a binomial distribution. I've kind of stylized that by drawing a smooth distribution like this. But you get the idea, right? Now, this is, let's say I've drawn this picture for a particular group size, let's say 10 voters, right? Now, the mean of the distribution is obviously P. Each vote is correct with probability P, so the expected fraction of correct votes is P. But the actual realized fraction of correct votes may end up being more than P or less than P, and that's what this distribution is capturing, right? And so the way I've drawn it, there's still a significant chance that the proportion of correct votes in a group of 10, let's say, will fall below half, right? The entire area under this curve, up to half, captures the probability that the jury will be wrong. Yes. So for a small enough jury, that could be a substantial probability because this distribution could be well spread out. Now, what happens if we keep all other parameters the same and just add more jury members, make the jury larger? I'll have a new distribution whose mean will still be P, but its variance will get lower. The distribution will get more clustered around its mean, which is P, right? So something like this. We'll have a new distribution, the pink curve, with the same mean, but much of the probability weight has moved closer to the mean, right? And so the law of large numbers is really a formalization of this idea that as I keep increasing the jury size or the sample size, if you will, what will happen is much of the probability comes around the mean and the tails keep getting thinner and thinner. And so if I make it large enough, I'll reach a situation where, you know, the probability below half will get vanishingly small. Yet another way to think about it is the following. Let's say I'm creating 99% confidence intervals, right? So what will be the correct what will be the realized fraction of correct votes in the jury? Well, expect the mean of that is P. Okay, what is the 99% confidence interval? Right, based on these distributions, I can construct that. Right, that 99% of the probability will lie in this range regarding what is a fraction of correct votes. Yes, so you have the blue interval. And if it looks like this, that means that, the probability that they'll vote correctly, that they'll choose correctly is less than 99%. Why? Because part of the 99% confidence interval stretches into, the below half territory. Yes. Now, what happens when you increase the sample size, and in this case, the jury size, is that your confidence interval shrinks. So with a larger jury, it'll be this pink confidence interval. Still, it's stretching into less than half territory. So still, we can't say that there's a less than 1% chance they'll make a mistake. But as you increase the jury size, it'll eventually reach a point where the confidence interval lies entirely above half. That means that the probability that they'll vote correctly is at least 99%, because the entire 99% confidence interval lies above the decision-making threshold. So that'll make sure that the jury chooses correctly. So that's your simplest illustration of wisdom of crowds through voting. Yes. Any questions? No questions. What assumptions of this exceedingly simple model do we want to change?
So no, communication sounds restrictive.
Communication sounds restrictive, but if you are thinking about common interest problems or substantially common interest problems, where our differences arise not from clashing interests, but due to different information, right? So there, assuming limited communication is absolutely essential to make the problem non-trivial and interesting. If you allow full communication in a complete common interest voting game, it's just boring. Right? We'll end up telling each other frankly what we know, and then we'll all agree about what the right course of action is. So the assumption of limited communication is called for not on grounds of realism, but on grounds of interest. In those problems where communication is difficult, that's where the problem actually is.
So one point here is that sometimes jurists might not want to share the information that they have, as in they might have their own biases which they might feel are politically incorrect, and therefore they might not outright say it, but they might present it as other information. For example, if in the case of the United States, white juries are more likely to convict African American uh, defendants, then they might not, conversations about race might not keep into that information sharing that happens when juries are deliberating, but it might factor into individual decision making.
Yes. So I did gross injustice to Arnav's question, and Ria has corrected me. Okay, this is why you need many heads, and rather than one lecturer coming and making pronouncements. So okay. So what is Ria's point? Ria's point is that, look, you have kind of committed you've made two very extreme assumptions. One is that everybody's interests are perfectly aligned, right? And the other is they cannot talk at all with each other. Now, many problems have a mixture that people's interests are not, to a large extent they are aligned, and to some degree there's conflict of interest. So the differences between people may be partly because of information, but partly also because of diverging interests or goals or motives or values. Yes. Now, so Ria's example is, jury trials. Yeah, by and large, people want to convict the innocent, convict the guilty and let go the innocent. But people may also have biases, right? If I'm in a jury and my fellow jury members, some of them may be biased against African Americans or groups like that. So even if they tell me that their signal is that the guy is guilty, I may still be skeptical, right? Is it genuinely guilty, or is this just a racist who wants to hang somebody no matter what? Okay, so once you think of more hybrid problems where information and preferences are both somewhat disparate, then even if you allow for communication, something interesting goes on, right? There's the Crawford-Sobel kind of credibility issues come in. And, even if you can talk before voting, the problem may not reduce to triviality because, I may not believe everything that my fellow jurors have said. I may think that they're biased, they're racist, they're prejudiced, they're sexist or something. So I still have a choice whether to be influenced by their information or their claims or not. Yes. So yes, voting preceded by communication can be very interesting if you have a hybrid model of non-common interest voting, right? If you go to the other extreme where interests are, where it's like a zero sum or something, right? Whatever choice is good for you is bad for me, then again, the communication becomes trivial because I won't believe a word of what you say. Bias factor is extreme, but there may be all kinds of intermediate cases. Now, in terms of theory, there isn't much actually. There are a few papers, and I think I put one or two on the reading list, but it's pretty hard to analyze voting along with Crawford-Sobel kind of cheap talk. Yes, there's a little bit of literature, but not a very well thrashed out one. But intuitively, yeah, those problems are very interesting. So maybe some of you will write a good paper on that. Yeah. Excellent point here. Yeah.
So just to sort of add to the discussion,
Hmm.
so essentially what you're saying is that in a pure common interest problem, as the one that we are looking at right now, voting is simply stepping in for communication.
Yes. Yes. Go ahead. Did you have something? I'll respond to what you just said.
Yeah. So if people could really communicate and put together the diverse pieces of information, they would want to do so because interests are perfectly common. But if there was some reason that they can't do that, then voting steps in.
Yeah. Yeah. So let's go back to pure common interest problems, right? Let's take away the complication of mixed motives, etc., etc. If you had two stages, first stage was communication, cheap talk messages between the voters, and then a second stage is voting. Then the problem of communication and choice becomes completely separable. We first communicate, we first tell each other what we know, then we make a choice, right? The instrument through which we are making a choice and the instrument through which we are communicating with each other are completely different. Yes. So each instrument serves its own purpose. Done. Yes. Voting without communication, right? When we go out on polling day and cast our votes, in some sense, it's trying to do too much. It is communication as well as choice.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So at the end of the day, when I go home and switch on my TV and, I learn that 90% of the people voted differently from what I did in a problem where our interests fundamentally are the same. Then I tell myself, oh, I voted like an idiot. Whatever I was thinking was very likely wrong. Look at so many people voting the other way. So the vote does communicate something to me, but by the time it's too late, I can't go back and change my vote. Yes. So in this structure that we are investigating here, Voting is trying to aggregate information or communicate and make a decision simultaneously. And that's why the question is interesting. That's why it's challenging. Can it do the two functions simultaneously? Yes. And that's why Condorcet is relevant and interesting. And that's why you see conditions that, okay, in this simplest of models, we need P greater than alpha. If P is less than alpha, it just goes pear-shaped and everything falls apart. Okay, we'll see more sort of complex manifestations of this, whether these two functions can be done simultaneously through the voting process if there's no pre-vote communication allowed. Yes, when we bring in strategic voting, we'll see much more nuance in this, trying to juggle two balls at the same time.
Yes.
Anything else?